Tov, today's Daf Yomi is Bava Metzia Mem Beis. Bava Metzia 42. The Daf is dedicated to a Shmira for Am Yisrael, for a Shmira for the Chayalim, Yeshua for Am Yisrael, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim. As we are today on Mem Beis in Bava Metzia, Hamafkid Maos Eitzal Chavero. So somebody deposits money with his friend. Tzaran Vev Shilin Lachorov. He binds up the money and places it behind him. Osha Masarim of no Vito Akatanim. Or he gives it over to his children who are minors, and he doesn't properly secure them. He doesn't close the door properly. Chayev, in all these cases, if the money is lost, since he didn't do a proper watching of the money, then he has to pay the owner of the money. Shalosh Shomer Kederach HaShomer. He didn't watch it. Shalosh Shimer Kederach HaShomer. They watch it the way it was supposed to be watched. If he watched it in a normal manner, then pater, then he'll be exempt. Mari asks, I understand why all these cases he didn't watch it properly, except what's wrong with tying it up in a bundle and placing it behind him? Tied up the money in your hands. That's what the pasuk says, which means afal pisha true, and even though it's tied up, you biyadcha, it needs to be in your hands, not behind you. Person should always be holding the money in their hands, as it says, a person should always diversify, to take his money and split into thirds. Shlish bekarka, shlish beprakmatia, shlish tachas yado. Third in real estate, a third in business, and a third liquid. Rashi says you need the third liquid to be able to be ready to invest if there's an opportunity. A blessing is only found on something that's not visible to the eye. Only if you keep something hidden will it truly be blessed. As it states, Itzav Hashem itcha, es habracha b'asamecha. Hashem will command the blessing on your silos. And the word asamecha, which means silos, the rabbis say here, it means samoy, hidden. Tana de Beirishmo in the bracha mitzvah b'davar she'ena ayin shaletismo. Blessing is only found on something that the eye doesn't rest on. As it states, Yitzav Hashem Yitcha et habracha v'hasamecha. Tan Rabbanan ha'olech hamud es gorano. Somebody goes to count his grains. He should make a bracha first. He should say, Yir tzom afanecha Hashem Elokeinu. May pray well Hashem our God should tishlach bracha b'maaseh yadenu. They shall send forth a blessing to the work. Yisrael Amud, he begins to count. He says, Baruch hashalech bracha b'kriyah zeh. Blessed is the one who sends a blessing into this bundle. Madad v'achach birech, but once you count and then you make the bracha, harezet tefillah shav, that's a useless prayer. So it means that you have to say the blessing beforehand. You can't make the bracha on something that was already weighed, already counted, or already measured. Only something that you don't know about yet. Until you know about it, you can ask God to maybe make it a good counting. But once you know about it, you can't make the bracha anymore. It says, so Amar Shmuel Ksafim Elam Shmira. Money you can't watch, Ela Bakarka. The only way you can watch money is in the ground. Meaning to say you have to bury it in the ground. Another way I was thinking to read it is, money you can't watch, Ela Bakarka. You're going to basically die. You can't take the money into the ground with you. What can you have a watching of? What we're going to be doing the next 2 weeks. Shmur matzah. Matzah you could have a watch, but money, ksafim elam shmira. Definition, what's the matzah we eat on Seder night? Shmur matzah, watched matzah. Money cannot be watched. It's karka, it's ground. Amar Rava, Modi Shmuel. Shmuel himself admits, Be'erev Shabbos bein hashmashos. On Friday afternoon, right before Shabbos, there you don't have to put the money in the ground. There the rabbis didn't make you bury it. V'ishal Motzi Shabbos shiro mikvarenu. And if you wait until Motzi Shabbos, the amount to bury it, will kavrinu, and you didn't bury it, mechayev, then we're going to say that you're liable. V'yitzor mirabbananu, but if you're a Torah scholar, savar doma mibayle zuze lavdalta. That if you're a Torah scholar, then we say maybe the guy who gave you the money needs money to make Havdalah, so you don't have to bury it right away. Or maybe you need to make Havdalah. Either way, there's different approaches amongst the Rishonim. Nowadays, we have a lot of people, they tap the ground to look for it, watch it so therefore you have to watch it in the ceiling. But then we have people who break the ceilings, then you have to put it between the bricks. Amaravo Moda Shmuel Bekosel, where Rabbi says Shmuel admits that if you put it inside the walls, that's okay. Nowadays there's tapuchai, people who tap the walls to look for the hollow spots. You have to put it right next into the ground. Or right next to the beams. Rav Yossi says, Ravashi, Hasam Tanan, there we learned Chametz Shenafo of Rapoas. Let's say you have Chametz and you have a building fell on it. Hareu Kamavur. We look at the Chametz as though it's destroyed. Rashbag comes along to explain this position, and he says, Kol Sheina Kelav Yochol Chape Sacharav. He says, what does that mean if there's a building that fell on it? If the dog can't reach it, how much is the extent that the dog has to look after it and not reach it? Gimel tefachim. If it's 3 tefachim into the ground, approximately 3 handbreadths, like 9 to 12 inches. So now we have the question: when we say you have to bury money in the ground, do we require 3 tefachim? Oh. Do we require that you have to bury 3 tefachim into the ground or not? So that was the question that he asked Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi's response was, no, in the case of the chametz, we're worried about the smell, that you might smell it, so therefore require the 3 tefachim. But here we're just trying to cover it up from your eye, so we don't require the 3 tefachim. The kama, and so how much should we require you to bury it in the ground to be covered up from the eye? It says, Amarafra misechra tefach, just 1 tefach. Ugaver, there was a man, the Ifka Juzi Gabi Chavre. Mar's going to give several stories. There was a man who left some money with his friend. Usfinu b'tzrifa to Urbani. So the guy put it in a basically a willow, a tent made out of willows. Ignov, it was stolen. So Amar Rav Yosef, says, okay. Even though with respect to theft, Nitirusahi, it's considered stolen. It was considered watched, even though it wasn't buried in the ground, but it was put in a place where people typically wouldn't find it. But he put it in a place that's very dangerous. The reason why people don't put it there because it can make a fire. So that goes back to our case of Chayev. So this is what we're saying, that if you start with negligence, even though in the end it was an accident that it was stolen, we're still going to hold you responsible. Alternative version of the story is even though with respect to a fire it was negligent, with respect to robbers it was considered guarded. And so therefore it's and therefore we start with negligence, we end in an accident. This Ika de Amri says you're exempt. But how do we paskin? We paskin like the lishna kama, like the first expression, and we say that in this case he'd be responsible because even though he was protecting against theft, he was exposing it to a fire through his negligence. Another case, if Kedzuzi Gabi Chavre, one person deposited money with his friend. He says, "Give me my money back." He says, "I forgot. I don't know where it is." Because anytime you say, I don't know, that's your negligence. Zil Shalom, you have to go and pay. Another case, a beautiful case. El Gavra da Afkidzuzi Gavi Chavra. Shlaminu Ima. So Reuben put his money with Shimon as a deposit, and Shimon gave it to his mother to watch. Vusfinu Bakartalita. And Shimon's mother put it in a box. Ignov, she didn't bury it, she just put it in the box. Negligent, and it was stolen. So Amar Rava, Hechi Nidainu Dina Dina. How do we look at this case? Name away with the day, Zil Shalem. Should we say to the person who was given to Ayi Shimon in this case, okay, go pay back Reuven? He would say, Amar, why? What did I do that was negligent? The fact that I gave it to my mother, I was allowed to. As we said, on the top of Membeis and Membeis, anybody who deposits something, he understands he's going to give it to his wife and his children to watch. Let's say he would say to his mother, go pay. Amrlo, she would say, Lo Amrli, I didn't know it wasn't yours. If I knew it wasn't yours, I would have buried it. But since I thought it was yours, then presumably she thought you needed it. Shimon needed it right away, so therefore she didn't bury it. Name away. So he says, Name away. So then, name away, Amailo Amrsla. So let's say we would say to Shimon, why didn't you tell her? Amar Kol Shekain, the Chiamino Didi Ninut famous Darabo. He said, no, I didn't tell her because I thought if I told her it was mine, she'll do an even better shmir on it, an even better protection. So in the end, so what do we have to do? So Rava says Shimon in this case should swear that he gave this money to his mother. And his mother should swear she put it in the box and it was stolen. Upater, and they're both going to be exempt. So now we come to the next case. Oh, apatrapa diavsmi. There was an executor for a state of orphans. The Zabin Tura asked me, he bought an ox for the orphans, and he gave it over to a rancher, to a cattle guy. So now, what happened? The ox turns out it didn't have any teeth to eat with, and it died. So at this point, what are we going to do in this case? What's our case? Should we say to the executor, Zil Shalom, go pay back the orphans because you destroyed their ox? He said, why? I gave the ox over to the rancher. It's his job to watch it. Zil Shalom. Go to the rancher and say, go pay back the orphans. Amar ana bahade turi ukimta. He said, I was told to watch this ox. He says, I was told to watch this ox. And I put this ox with all the other oxen. And I threw it out. I threw it food. So why is that my problem? I didn't know it didn't eat. So now the Gemara says, okay, so what's the halacha? Both of them are claiming, not my fault. The executor says I gave it to the rancher, and the rancher says I gave it food. The Gemara says, well, well, since the rancher was hired by the orphans, isn't he responsible? He should have looked. He should have checked out the matter. Should have checked to see if it's eating. Gemara says, if the orphans would have lost money, fine. The Gemara says, yeah, you're right. If the orphans lost money, then the rancher would have to pay them back. But he didn't lose money here because they went back to the guy who sold them the cow, and they said, give us the money for it, and he gave it to them. Elaman katan. So if that's the case, who's making a claim? So that so much so that we said at the top of the case, And Rabbi Bar Chama said, who's the one who's making the claim? So the Gemara says, Mari the Torah Katayin. So now, after the owner of the ox paid back the orphans, so now the owner of the ox is making a claim against the executor. Means to say the orphans collected the money back from the executor, from the owner of the ox. Now the owner of the ox is going to the executor and asking for money. He said, Ibayale lo duan. He said, what's his claim? He said, you should have told him that the ox can't eat. So the Gemara says, I don't understand this question. My modinwe, what do you mean to say? What should he tell the owner of the ox? Made the yada to make the owner of the ox and the executor both could see the ox and they see that there's no teeth there. What do you mean that the owner of the ox says to the executor, you should have told me? So the Gemara says, now we're talking about a case that there was, it was like it was retail, it was a middleman, that the seller of the ox sold it to the orphans, but he didn't really first check it out. So the day that he had bought that ox, on the same day he sold it, and he didn't know that it didn't have teeth, and so therefore he makes a claim against the executor. Why don't you tell me that the ox can't eat, and then I could have fixed it? Hilkoch, therefore, mishtabu iu delo aviyada, therefore the owner of the ox, the middleman, has to take an oath that he didn't know that it didn't have teeth. And so therefore, the shepherd now, who took the place of the executor, has to pay So the executor has to pay. So the shepherd, who basically stood in place of the executor, has to pay to the middleman the price of basically meat at a cheap price. We'll look at the Rashi here. Rashi says, a very long Rashi. How does he know this law? What does the middleman have to pay with the shepherd? He is not his watchman. We learn out from the Mishnah that if somebody rents a cow to his friend, and so basically he rents it out to somebody else and it dies, and he borrows it to come Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi says you have to return the cow to the original owner. Hilkach and halacha Rabbi Yossi. So we see from here, even though the owner is not the Baal Davar of the borrower, and the renter is not missing anything because he's exempt from accidents. Since the renter could collect from the borrower, the original owners can come and collect from the borrower. So too here also, since the orphans can go back to the shepherd and collect from him, because they hired him, then the owners can come in the place of the orphans and collect. And so therefore, if the orphans were losing money, if the orphans were the ones losing money, then they wouldn't make a compromise. Because orphans can't make a compromise. But now that he's collecting the money for the Baalim, now that he's collecting the money for the owners, the Khan ain't Pshia Kolkach, and there's not so much negligence, because he could say, the ranchman could say, I put it with the other oxen. Therefore, he told Pshir B'nayim. Therefore they made a compromise, and he doesn't have to pay the full value of the ox. And if it had died, Ella or Yachzir Baalim, so he returns the skin, the hide, and he pays 2/3 of the meat. So basically, they're making a compromise, a little bit of a compromise between the original owner and the ranchman. So that's the case there. That the guy who sold it to the orphans has to swear he didn't know, and now he has to pay the shepherd and the ranchman has to pay to this seller of the ox 2/3 of the value of the meat. So now there was a man who put some deposited hops with his friend. Whereas the guy who was watching the hops, he had his own hops next to it. So he says to basically his manager there, he shows him, take your money from this pile of hops. Also Rami Meidach, but instead of taking his pay from the hops of the owner of the field, he took it from the hops that were there on deposit. So what's going to be the halacha? So it says Amarava Heichi Nidainu Dine Lahai Dina. How we go Amarav Amram? How are we going to look at this case? Should we say to him that he has to pay the value of the hops back to the person who put the deposit? He said, I didn't do anything. I told him to take it from the other one. I didn't take it from there. I told him to take it from the other one. So what did I do wrong? He's the one who did it. And he said, we have to say here, the Ritva says he's an unpaid watchman. So it wasn't his negligence. So that basically, why can he say to the person who was watching it, he's not responsible? Let's say we say to the manager, okay, you have to pay back the person who deposited the hops. He says, well, I don't have to pay anything. He didn't tell me take from this one and not from that one. So each one claims they don't have to pay. And so then the Gemara asks, but let's say, the Gemara is asking, Rashi says, if when he saw take from this one and take from this one, his pile of hops was closer than the pile of the deposit, and basically the watchman, the person who was supposed to bring it, and he didn't bring it, so basically the case here is, Rashi says, the Gemara is saying, the Gemara is asking if the Gemara is asking a question, Rashi says, if his barrel of hops was closer than the deposit, and then the agent who was bringing it was delayed from the time it takes to bring the closer one, he didn't bring it, that the owner is revealing that he liked him to take it from the deposit and he wasn't objecting, and so therefore he'd have to pay. So the Gemara says, no, it was the same amount of time, meaning to say that the deposit was not farther away than his own hops, and so therefore he couldn't tell. Well, so my pseida. So the Gemara says, well, what did the person who was the watching the deposit, what did he lose? Basically, he was benefiting by the fact that he took the hops of the picadon. And so pay back the guy who the picadon. If this guy took his hops as their salary, so you have to pay back the owner of the hops. So the Gemara says, no, Amar of Sami Brei Rava, Dava Shichra Chala. Basically, you can't pay him back because the beer in which he put the hops in it turned into vinegar. And so therefore he didn't benefit anything. And so therefore he doesn't want to have to give him his own hops in exchange. Meaning to say that it was useless. It was a bad batch. Rav Ashi says, Bekise, no, it was that the hops of the picadon was worse. It had thorns in it. And so therefore the beer didn't basically work. And so therefore the person who had the money deposited with him does not want to give him his own in exchange because then he's going to lose. So umesham way to make kisi, and so therefore he only wants to pay him the value of the hops of the thorns, and he doesn't want to give him his own hops in exchange for it. Okay, that's today's daf. You owe me a beautiful daf, and we continue tomorrow, and we'll finish, God willing, the chapter. I don't know if we'll finish tomorrow, but we're almost done with this beautiful chapter. Shkoyach to everybody. Everybody have it. Shkoyach.
Thank you.
Shkoyach.